Hello, Garland, Nixon here, and we are hanging out with Dr. Jim Kavanaugh. We're going to talk about the seeming collapse of the coalition of the witless, and of course, some real interesting things happening with the RFK Jr. situation on Capitol Hill. Let's talk. Hello, Garland, Nixon, and we're hanging out with the one and only Dr. Jim Kavanaugh.
My fan club.
That's right. That's right. And before we get going, as always, we have to have a word from Keir Starmer. Well, that sets things up perfectly. The coalition of we've had everything, the coalition of the killing, the coalition of the witless, all kinds of things like this. But what's interesting, I heard Mark Rutte there, you'll hear him crumble one day and admit the truth, and the next day there. And someone was saying about, basically saying, the Russians may not agree with this or that. And Rutte saying, oh, they don't get a say in this. The Russians? I mean, he's like, so what? They don't get to be a part of this conversation. What are you talking about? Come on, the Russians. And he's like, Putin, he's like the governor of Texas here. And I'm thinking, yeah, except Texas doesn't have nuclear weapons and they're not kicking your ass right now, Yeah. So the refusal to accept reality, the refusal to, but then they will every now and then, and then they won't every now and then. Anyway, your thoughts on this, Mark, Jim?
Yeah. Look, I saw something the other day, and it's exactly right. They cannot accept or believe the fact that they can't set the terms of everything. They are convinced that they're still the ones, the Americans ultimately set the terms. And they sit around for months negotiating among themselves and come up with what they think is a great idea that will be one that based ultimately on American power, because the Europeans do not have the power to send in a security force. They're not going to do it. They can't do it. Again, they have to say, oh, the Americans have to back us up. So really it's based on, but they have the idea that the Euro-American alliance sets the terms for the world, sets the terms of debate, and sets the terms of the circumference beyond which you cannot go. And they think the Russians will accept it because that was the case for 30, 40 years. The Americans accepted, defined the terms of the debate, and the rest of the world pretty much accepted it. They defined the terms of the discourse and of action, and the rest of the world has accepted it. And that's no longer the case. They don't have the power to set terms anymore. And the countries of the world, Russia and China and India and and Iran and other countries which have achieved a level of economic and political and military power. We saw it in China that really it's over. You cannot.
In Iran. No, Iran.
I said Iran. Yeah. I mean, you can't push these countries around anymore. You couldn't defeat Afghanistan. You couldn't defeat countries like Afghanistan, Yemen. Yeah, right. So, but you're gonna browbeat the Chinese and the Russians. You're gonna browbeat, in this case, the Russians to accept terms that they absolutely will not accept, and they're beating you. They beat the entire NATO apparatus. Ukraine army in 2022 was a NATO supplied army, and from 2022 to 2023 really was and they said it was the strongest army in Europe. It was a NATO army with NATO weapons, with NATO and not only advisors, but it was being run by the Americans in Wiesbaden, and they couldn't defeat the Russians. And the Russians found out, nobody knew in February 2022 what was going to happen. The Americans thought, oh, we will give them the sanctions from hell. We will destroy the Russia with sanctions. The oligarchs will overthrow Putin because they have to, because they can't abide by the sanctions. And it just wasn't true. And the Russians found out that they could live with American sanctions, and they found out that they could produce a military apparatus that was powerful enough to defeat the entire NATO, everything NATO could throw at them except NATO troops. And there's not enough European troops to throw, so it'd have to be American troops. And the Americans are now in this situation. I mean, who knows what Donald Trump realizes or thinks or whatever, where he thought he could, with his charm or the power of his great personality, solve this, persuade or cajole or browbeat Putin in 24 hours to stop the war according to the terms that he wanted to set. And he found out after months of back and forth that it's not going to happen. I hope he's found out. Maybe he hasn't. I don't know. He could change his mind tomorrow. And again, all of these European leaders and certainly the militaries know this. And the European leaders, 1 minute will say, yeah, we can't really win. We'll never defeat Russia. And the other say, yeah, but we can defeat them if we just get more weapons or we just send more money. They just don't want to accept that they have been overtaken militarily, economically, and politically in terms of the political support in the world that Russia has in this, and therefore militarily. And they're not going to overcome that. They're not. And they kind of know it, and they're getting closer and closer to acknowledging it. But there's a huge psychological and ideological momentum and that they just don't want to admit, because then they have to admit we're going to have to deal with Russia and China and other countries as equal partners in the world. And they don't want to do that. I don't know to the extent to which they're going to go, including Trump, including the United States, including the neocons, which is still running foreign policy, to deny that defeat that they have suffered and the relegation of the United States to, it is not the primary power in the world. It's a primary power, and it's a strong power, but it is not the primary power in the world that can set the terms diplomatically and politically and militarily within which everybody else has to operate.
The second part, I'd like to get you to comment on this, and that is and that's something you've been talking about for a while, and we're seeing that, the panic. There's one thing to just march around and strut around and say the Russians don't have any authority, and they're going to fall, and Ukraine will be able to stand up to them, right? But recently, a Russian general had a map. That map had Odessa on it. Yeah. He's like, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, hey, we tried to be nice, but I got to be frank. If I were the Russians, and based on everything I've seen, this is your one shot. You got to do what you got to do right now, because they ain't going to give up. Which means if I know that they've brought everything they could into Odessa, they've launched attack, they've used it as a platform for attacks. They've said, oh boy, we'll go up and take Transnistria and all this kind of stuff. If I'm the Russians, I got to get the land bridge to Transnistria. Got to do that. And you know what? They ain't getting Odessa. I'm taking everything. This is it. It's over. I'm in a position of strength. I'm not fighting this war over and over. And if they come after me next time, they're going to be very weak in this region. I would not be surprised, based on the way things are going. They're going to go. And that was, I think, a hint, shall we say. But Nazis don't take hints. Anyway, which means at some point, the coalition will is going to wake up and say, crap, they're taking everything, including Odessa. There ain't a whole lot we can do about it, which is a very dangerous time, Jim.
Yeah, I think that is the scenario that is most likely to provoke the West, and the United States really has to decide at that point, if the Russians go for Odessa, because it means they control all of Ukraine, has no access to the Black Sea without that. And Odessa is culturally a Russian city. It's powerfully in the imagination of Russia, something that's theirs. There was one of the worst massacres in 2014, 2015, after the Maidan, was in Odessa, because Odessa was against the fascist coup in Kiev, and the fascists there drove people into the trade union center, set fire to it, burned people alive. The police stood by and did nothing. It was a horrible scene in Odessa, and the Russians haven't forgotten that. And there are a couple of places. I think Kharkiv is another place, but Odessa certainly has a place in the Russian imagination. And I think you are right that end of day here, and don't forget, Putin for 8 years was trying to be nice was trying to resisted the wishes of the Donbas republics to recognize them as independent and even to bring them into, and he had a lot of dissent from within Russia on that. And what he did in 2020, in February, March, April 2022, when he pulled back from Kiev while they were negotiating, as a gesture of good faith, that was resisted by the army. So, and now he's gotten to the points as of last year, 2023, 2024, he's saying, I'm going to let the army run this situation and see what they can do. So I think it is likely that the Russians are going to go for Odessa. And I think if it hasn't, if the Americans and Europeans haven't thrown in the towel and given up by then, they are going to be challenged at that point, and there's going to be a lot of pressure not to let them do that, because that's going to be that is going to reduce Ukraine to a subaltern state, really, of Russia, and that's, the Ukrainians could have had something else. January 2022, February 10th to February 20th of 2022, all during the Minsk Accords, they could have had just Russians or Donbas republics are independent, or they're autonomous. They weren't even asking for it. Putin certainly was not demanding, or he was resisting the idea of independence and saying, no, you got to stay as autonomous, semi-autonomous republics within Ukraine. But Ukrainians didn't want that. And what they did was they went to war. And they went to war. The fascists in Ukraine went to war knowing they would lose, knowing that the only way they could win was to get the Americans, NATO/the Americans, involved. That was their purpose. That was their objective. They never imagined they were going to defeat Russia. They thought, and they always knew, what we're doing here is creating a situation where the Americans and NATO will have to become involved. And they bet Boris came in February of April, May of 2022, when the Ukrainians were negotiating and said, no, stay in and we'll make sure that you win. We'll give you everything you need. So the Americans and Europeans, Boris Johnson came in on behalf of the British and the Americans and said, stay in this war, keep fighting. So the Ukrainians were given the green, not just the green light, the assurance by Boris Johnson that we're going to make sure you win this. And that was a false assurance. They can't do that. And it's a mess. So at some point in the relatively near future, the Americans are going to have to decide whether they throw in the towel and admit defeat, which cannot be denied, or start a nuclear war, because those are the alternatives they have.
And my position, that ain't what the U.S. does. There's a reason they use proxies, and I mean use proxies. And historically speaking, they put a proxy out there, and when somebody beats the crap out of the proxies, they exercise the, as I call it, the Samsonite option, right? They walk away. That's what they've always done. They put and I think the Europeans don't get that. The Europeans think, well, this is Europe. They won't do it to us. Sure, they did it, and they walked away and let the Taliban and Vietnam. And every single time they've always walked away and leave their proxies to get torn to shreds and walk away from them. But we're the Europeans. They won't do it to us. Yeah, they absolutely will do it to you right now. And here's what I think, though. The way the Russians do things, look, they do not want to harm Odessa. But one thing I got to throw at you, Jim, and that is, if in fact there was any possibility that the Russians at some point could have an honest discussion with the Ukrainians or the Europeans or NATO, okay, yeah, they could get out of this without taking everything, but that's not possible. Recently, when the Russians said, look, we're always willing to talk, one of the things that's important is the rights of the Russian speakers in Ukraine to worship the way they want, to have their culture, to speak their language. And the Ukrainians came out and said, funny you should say that. We're going to outlaw the Russian church now. You know what I mean? If the Russians say to the Ukrainians, we're willing to talk as long as you don't splash water on the Russians. Oh, really? They'll throw them all in a pool. What they do is anything the Russians say that this is what it would take, they go overboard to show there is no possibility of that. It's just the opposite. We don't want to talk to you. We hate you. We want to fight you. We hate the Russian speakers. We want to kill them all. And the Russians leave an open door, but ultimately that's all the Russians are going to get. And I think they know it, but they have to appear gentlemanly. Well, we'd love to talk to you. We hate you. Okay, well, we're going to kill about another 50,000 of you. We'd like to talk again. We hate you. Not a problem. We'll kill 50,000 more. I don't think they'll take Odessa in these big cities. I think they'll snap the neck of the Ukrainian army and walk in. You know what I mean? They will snap this thing once they get finished. Somebody was in there saying, oh, as long as it's taken to get finished the Donbass. The Donbass is like the most heavily fortified place on earth. They're going to clean that up. But after that, it's flatlands. It's steppe. There ain't nowhere to hide or fortify. So I think they're going to crush the Ukrainian military again. And as you say, well, then there'll be EU gnashing and weeping and gnashing of teeth in the EU, but they don't have anything to fight with, even if they want to. And their citizens will not allow it. And they'll probably be, scrounging around for bread, by the way things are looking by then. But I think the Russians are going to just wipe the floor with that military. And once they've destroyed the military, they'll be able to take anything they want in Ukraine, because there won't be a political or a military hierarchy or structure or really anything that's going to be there to prevent them from doing that. That's my opinion.
Well, yeah, the Russians cannot lose, but the Americans can upend the table with nuclear weapons, essentially. But what I'm going to say is, I don't know how it's going to end up militarily. I think the Russians will defeat them in the Donbass. They'll take over, and I think they'll be able to defeat them in Odessa if they want to take Odessa. But I think it's likely that they, meaning the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the Europeans, will try to put up a fight over Odessa. Now, it may not be. They may be over by then, and they may have already thrown in the towel. The Europeans and Americans might have thrown in the towel and just give up on it. But I'm not sure of that, and I don't know. And we have this problem, and it's the problem the Russians had. I said it from the beginning of this, that the real hardest thing and the most difficult thing the Russians have set for themselves in this such special military operation is the denazification of Ukraine, because it is the case that over the past 20 years, the ideology of Nazism, of Nazi fascism, has been Banderism has become dominant in Western Ukraine, and that is those forces who are armed and have a kind of stranglehold and a blackmail and a sort of Damocles over any administration in Ukraine. They've been in this to get Russia. That's what they want. And they're willing to give up, to kill a lot of, let a lot of Ukrainians go. They want the dismemberment of the defeat and dismemberment of Russia. That's their main goal. And they're not going to give up. And the Russians, if they will find ways of resisting. And if the Russians, so in order to denazify Ukraine, you have to kind of defeat that ideology, which has had now a generation to redevelop from what was there in World War II. And as I've said, but the other side of that coin is, you say, oh, that's an impossible thing to do. That's very difficult to do. But the Americans and the Europeans, if they think they're going to get the Ukrainian government to agree to anything less than the defeat of Russia, they have to denazify, because they're going to be in a fight with the Nazis. And so I think you have the likelihood of some kind of political fight in Kiev, essentially, which is going to be a fight with the Nazis and with the fascists. And I don't know who's going to win that. I don't know how it's going to take place, but they have to. Someone's going to have to, when this ends, or for it to end, the fascist elements in Ukraine, which are very strong, are going to have to be defeated. And that's going to be an armed fight. There's going to be people, Ukrainians, there's going to be a little civil war in Kiev. And, somebody's going to have to step in to that and help the non-fascists, the anti-fascists put an end to it. And I don't know who that's going to be. I mean, either the Russians or the Americans, but it's an extremely dangerous situation for that reason. The Americans, again, have gotten in bed. They think they can control everything. The analogy with the Israeli Zionist fascists is, again, they think, oh, these are people, they're kind of on our side and we can control them. And no, you can't. They have an agenda, and they're not going to obey you either. They're going to fight you for their agenda. And you're going to end up having to either abandon them, as you did in Vietnam, and, chances are we'll do at some point in Ukraine, but we'll never do. Very unlikely to do in Israel. But you've gotten yourself in bed with people who are not obeying. They're not letting. They don't want you to set the terms either. So this is a difficult situation, and it's going to be. I'm not nonchalant or sanguine about the idea that, the Russians are going to win and it'll be over. I think there's a lot of places along the way between now and then, certainly talking about Odessa, where they still might say, we got to put up a fight here. And who they are is, including the United States.
Yeah, I remember Dr. Jeffrey Sachs saying, this was about a year or two ago, saying, I talked to a bunch of leaders in Europe personally behind the scenes. And I said to them, which one of you guys, if this comes down, would actually send troops? Would you? And everyone said no. They said, why? They said, because our government would fall, because the people would never stand for it. So I do have a feeling that the coalition of the willing sending troops is kind of a fraud to a certain extent. You know what I mean? I have a feeling that to a certain extent, because not only that, you have these people saying, we'll send troops. And then every now and then their military people come out and say, we don't have that. We can't do it. Right. And so the other part, I think, is this. I think a lot of this, we talk about it as though they want to send troops. They want to do this. They want to fight. They want to do this. That if it came down to it, Europe knows they have nothing. And they know that their countries would implode if they tried to send them. Right. Yeah. That number one, they don't have, the UK has somewhere between 24 and 40 operational tanks. I ain't going to take the Russian army out. I'm going to tell you that right now. You'll fight between 24 and 40 minutes before your army will be done, right? But they really know it. I do think a lot of this is posturing because they don't want any deal struck. And as long as they say, and if the Russians and Trump or whatever, they say, okay, we want a deal. And as long as they say, no, we're going to put troops in, they know, like you and I know, that the reason this war is there is because Russia won't allow Ukraine in NATO, and it sure as hell ain't going to allow NATO in Ukraine. Yeah. So I think a part of this, based on the things that you hear, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, these military people coming out, people that every now and then it'll slip out, we can't really do this, right? That a big part of this is we have to stop getting between the U.S. and the Russians talking and striking some kind of deal or trying to strike some deal that we got to keep this thing going. And the way we can do it is to continue to pretend that we want to put troops in there, because we know that's one thing that'll stop the Russians from ever signing a deal if they believe we're going to get troops in there. So that's another angle. What are your thoughts?
No, I don't think they're going to put troops in. The Europeans cannot. They know that. This is phony. This is baloney. They don't have the ability to do that. And they keep saying it. We can only do that if we get American backstop. The entire thing depends on American backstop on this. But you're right that as Obama said, this is not existential for us. This was existential for Russia. So, they could use do the Samsonite option and say, okay, we tried, but we're out, and that's that. We don't know the extent to which the forces in the United States, who are pushing Trump to attack Venezuela now for some goddamn reason.
I think it's related. I think it's related. It's crap. We're going to get a big loss. We're going to get punched in the face over here. Hey, we can go over here. Maybe we can attack a smaller country. You know what I mean? I think it's related. I think it's, let's distract them over here with this Venezuela so we kind of slip out and they won't exactly recognize we lost to the Russians. There's some of that there.
Well, yeah, of course. I think a lot of it is, Trump being persuaded or telling himself, okay, Vlad, that's your backyard, Ukraine. We can't fight you there, but this is our backyard here. And watch what we do. Watch how we exercise our power now by taking over this country in our backyard. So that's there. But what I'm saying is, I just, because they put so much on the line, and they said they created it for themselves. They didn't have to, as an existential issue for Europe and for NATO. And this is now an existential. This is a defeat of NATO. It is, and they're going to have to accept that, and it's going to be totally undermine NATO quickly, and so they're going to have to accept that. So can't be sure. And again, I think it can't be troops on the ground. And you're right. One of the main things that's going to stop this is political upheavals in Europe and the United States against this stuff. And there is no popular support in Europe or the United States for a war with Russia. So there's not going to be troops on the ground. They're going to have to decide whether to use tactical nuclear weapons, or there will be troops on the ground. They'll only put troops on the ground supported by tactical nuclear weapons, and they're going to have to decide whether to do that or not. And it
would be like this. What do you want to do, guys? I think we should all die.
Yeah, well,
that's a great idea, because exactly. As soon as you fire a nuke at Russia, you're all going to die. Yeah, every last one of you. This place is going to be a parking lot, and so is everything else. But that's it. What do you think we should do? What's the plan? We could. But the Americans are going to say to them. The Americans are capable of saying to themselves, first of all, they can persuade themselves again. They set the terms. Oh, we'll just use a little. It'll stay in Ukraine because Russia doesn't want to have a major nuclear exchange with us, and that's true. So we can keep it in the bounds of Ukraine and just persuade Russia to back off, because otherwise they're going to have to take a risk. And they're going to say this, and it's you're not crazy. Will Russia take the risk of a general nuclear exchange with the United States? What Russia will do will hit Europe, and the Americans will say, well, will they really hit Europe? And so if they hit Europe, that's not our problem. So I'm just saying, if we talk rationally and reasonably, and Jeffrey Sachs is a very reasonable person, it is impossible that they can do anything but admit defeat and go home. But none of these people are entirely rational actors. And this, acknowledging and accepting and going home with the undeniable defeat of NATO and the United States in what they have defined for themselves. They didn't have to, but they did, as an existential conflict with the great evil dictator Vlad the Impaler Putin. They're going to go home and have to say, okay, we accept it. We accept defeat here. And I'll believe that will happen. I see all the rational reasons why they must do that. The Americans will do it. It's nothing new. The Americans, defeat is nothing new. Americans lose every war. Every war we lose. The Americans are not in any way shocked by losing a war. In fact, they've become extremely good at losing wars.
And making people forget it. Making people
POW, MIA, and they got a black flag, and then they make some movies with Rambo trying to go get some American hostages, and then they, do some Afghanistan movie about some guys, who are trapped about something. They do Black Hawk Down. America is really good at losing wars. Propaganda that's the hell out of it. America's no problem. The Europeans are freaked out, but Americans like, we'll just redefine it as something that happened and move. And whoa, hey, look, Venezuela.
That's a very good point. They're also convinced they can set the terms of defeat, in the sense that they can set the terms of how the defeat is perceived.
Exactly. And
that is true. And
that's the only thing they care about is how Americans perceive the defeat.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting, this is kind of funny, but this is interesting. The American, what we heard in the beginning from the Biden people is, hey, the Putin wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. Remember that? He wants to reconstruct the Soviet Union, right? Which is kind of interesting. Let me show you this real quick.
It's clear. You can come.
Все чисто.
Да, все чисто.
Yeah.
Now, that's hilarious, because first of all, Sergei Lavrov is a hilarious guy.
Yeah.
But what he did, but it's interesting because they're like, yes, they would have revived the Soviet Union. Well, look, what did the Soviet Union do, and what would a country like the Soviet Union do? They always knew that they could get attacked. So all of these huge factories and everything that they had for war, they didn't let them rot. They kept them up. We come to find out they kept them up. They kept all of this stuff ready to go. They have, if you're familiar, and I have worked with Russians and worked with older people and people that grew up in the Soviet Union, they have a very well-educated and very well-motivated workforce. They had everything they need. And what's interesting is when attacked, one could argue they reached out to the legacy of the Soviet Union, whether it was, and what did they do? That was about, in a way, a message to everyone. Don't forget, we're the ones that kicked your ass last time. You know what I mean? Don't forget, we're the Soviet Union. Every time you fight us, you lose. There was some pride in there. I think there was a message to the Russian people. But again, as I said, I think what the Russians have is a legacy and a history of being warriors when they need to be warriors, of knowing how to organize their society in a bureaucratic way. When they first started, there was problems with corruption. There was man, they got that stuff straightened out. They put a war council inside. They're spitting out shells and uniforms. They're marching, looking crisp. And I'm like, man, they really, it's amazing. But again, how they kind of, it's like they're proud that we have the legacy of the Soviet Union, and that works for us. Yeah. Your thoughts on that, Jim?
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Look, there's a legacy of economic planning of the Soviet infrastructure, as you pointed out. The Soviet Union built up an incredible infrastructure. Again, like we say about China now, the Soviet Union took an impoverished rural country. They built it into one of the most powerful countries in the world, and they educated people. It was not just material infrastructure. They have an educated populace, and they won World War II. And there's a legacy of social solidarity. That's how they won World War II. They don't have the American cultural, rugged individualism, heroic.
The me generation. Remember that, Reagan? The me generation. That's Russia.
Well, this is part of American culture, the heightened sense of individualism, and there's a sense of social solidarity. We defeated Nazism because we stuck together and we hung together, and we know how to do that, and that's what's come back very strongly. And so they were able to mobilize the capital resources of society with planning, which is verboten in capitalist America, but in semi-capitalist with socialist characteristics, Soviet Union, we'll just go right back to that. And so this is the legacy of the Soviet Union. Certain elements of it are a very important part of this, and it's demonstrated itself. And really, what happened since, because as I say, in 2022, nobody really knew what was going to happen with the sanctions from hell. Nobody really knew what was going to happen.
The Russians were even sure.
That's right. They weren't. They couldn't be sure. When you faced an adversary that was fully armed and prepared and stocked by NATO and directed by NATO. So, it was a NATO army with Ukrainian personnel. And so they couldn't be sure about that. But now they know, and the world knows, and their allies know. China knows, North Korea knows, India saw, and everybody in the world now. This has been a turning point in historic history. It really has. The Americans thought, once again, we can push them the way we want with economic sanctions, and the ruble will be rubble, and the oligarchs will throw out Putin because that's what capitalist oligarchs do, and blah, 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 blah. And it didn't work out that way. And instead, you have Europe in crisis, economically, politically. They disarmed themselves militarily, and they're now very weak militarily. And the Americans have no way of getting out of this without blowing up the world. And so everybody has seen this. And the United States no longer has the power to intimidate. And nobody knew that quite until after February 2020. Look, Vladimir Putin was going along with the United States up until then. He was going along with, he made deals on the Maidan that they they betrayed the day after they made the deal. And then he made the Minsk one and they betrayed it. He made Minsk two and he betrayed it. So he was continuing to go along. And when Medvedev was the president of Russia, he was going along with the Americans in the Security Council, and the Chinese were, because the Americans were still setting the terms. But now everybody's saying, we don't have to do that anymore. We're going to get out of this and set the terms and not allow the Americans to set the terms. Oh, I got to say, they are allowing the Americans to set the terms in Israel and Gaza. That's the Americans and are setting the terms, and they're accepting that. They're not going to go in and upset the terms that the Americans have set, which is Israel can do anything it wants. So the Chinese and the Russians are accepting that because it's not in their national interest, existential problem for them. But that's a mistake, I think, because I think it is. But it's also ethically a horrible thing to do. But generally speaking, in the world as a whole, we will decide what we want to do. The Americans are not going to intimidate us. We have too much economic. They've pushed the Russians and the Chinese together, and they've pushed the BRICS together as a stronger force because they saw that the economic power the United States tried to wield against Russia didn't work. And they see that the United States and certainly Europe is struggling economically, and that they have the economic and political and military power to say to the United States, you no longer set the terms. We're going to set some terms for ourselves. So that's all a big turning point, and it's happened since February 2022. I mean, it was happening before that, but how this Ukraine war has developed has changed the course of history and made it clear that to all of these people, we can resist this. We no longer have to abide by the terms that the Americans set in the world, whether it's diplomatically, politically, militarily, or economically.
Absolutely. And, here's the thing. What have the Russians done? Can you call them capitalists? One thing for sure, they're not neoliberal capitalists, but here's the thing. They're not financialized. You know what I mean? They're not finance capital. They build and sell things. They got these gigantic companies that build power plants and stuff like that. They make and they build stuff and they sell stuff. There's a reality. There's a kinetic a reality to their economy. And I think that's why the U.S. is like, okay, sure. What we're finding out is this. We're going to sanction you. We're going to tariff you. You're going to be out of business. If you have a financialized economy, sure, it will put you out of business. But if you sell stuff and make stuff and grow stuff, there is a kinetic reality. And no matter when we take financial actions against you, I was watching this video of these, all of these farmers, this video just a little while ago, who were meeting. They were in wherever Tom Cotton and some other people are, right? Wherever that is. And they were talking to these people saying, man, we're going out of business. And he said, what do you need to do? He says, we got to do something with these tariffs and some of this stuff because soybeans and corn and this and that, we got to sell them. We can't afford. They're talking about, these combines cost $100,000, $500,000. This equipment is expensive. One guy said, I farm 800 acres, like pretty much just me and my boys. And all my stuff is paid for and I can't make it. He says, how are these other guys who are farming 800 acres and they got a staff of 25 and they got none of their stuff is paid for? Yeah. Forget it. It's over. We're all going to go to, and basically what we're hearing is the tariffs are going to collapse farming in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Russia, instead of fighting with you over farming, they're looking for more people to sell stuff to. Yeah. And people are coming to them saying, hey, we can't buy pork from America. And Russia says, we'll build pork farms.
Yeah. No, this is gone. I mean, and people don't realize that China has, turned away from America, and the BRICS countries are doing business among themselves in a way that the Americans don't even. The old exchanges, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, all of these that used to oversee the exchange of agricultural products in the world, they don't know what's happening, and with the tariffs, it just has, again, it's accelerated that process and brought it to a crisis point where in the capitalist, as he says, this guy says, I don't have another year. The farmers who make payments on their combines don't have 2 years to see what's going to happen after the tariffs. China's gone. That business is gone. The Russian business is gone. That's what we sold. One of the great exports industries of America is agriculture, and that's going. It's disappearing, and they don't know where it's disappearing to because China's going. Okay, we'll buy from Russia. We'll buy from
Brazil.
Brazil. We'll buy from Indonesia. So this is, and all of a sudden, everybody's waking up and saying, "Well, where's the business gone?" So, again, this is not to a certain extent. This is a capitalist competition in the world that's nothing particularly to do with socialism, but it has something to do with socialism in the sense that you say the legacy of socialism in the Soviet Union, certainly the reality of it in China, is that production is for purpose before profit. Okay. And there is production for profit, and there are capitalist relations of production, but that's still, they have the legacy of, we have to make sure that's subordinate to the purpose, to producing things for purpose. We want to produce weapons to win a war. We don't want to produce weapons that are high-ticket weapons, boutique weapons that defense industry contractors make billions on, and defense, the shareholders of that, live on, and blah, blah, blah. It's not about primarily about making profit, but it's about purpose. Housing. Look what private equity is doing to this country. It's destroying the housing market. It's buying up housing for speculation. Housing should be for living, not for profit speculation. This is nuts. When you buy up all the housing, all the private homes that are available in a neighborhood, and you turn them into rentals, and the private equity companies own all the private housing, what was previously private housing. I mean, and people can't afford to buy houses, and they can't afford to rent, and nobody controls that. Okay, because the primary objective and the prime objective in our capitalist society is to make as much money as you can, to allow individuals to make as much money as you can, rather than to make sure everybody has a house. And the housing industry becomes a vehicle for individuals and individual interests and private equity and whoever to make as much money as they can, rather than a vehicle for making sure everybody has good housing. So, and the legacy of the Soviet Union and the reality of China no, that's not our first priority. If someone can make some money on housing, we'll let them do it, but we got to make sure everybody has housing. And the primary purpose of, now, I don't know how that China and Russia are going to develop in that way, because certainly in Russia, there are enough capitalist relations, because our capitalist society wasn't that until 50 years ago. And, we were producing things, and in 2000, we were the producers for the world. That's how the dollar became the reserve currency of the world, because you could buy anything with a dollar, because everything that you needed was produced with the United States and was on sale for dollars. So the problem we have now is that we've given up the manufacturing for purpose and the production for purpose, and those countries are now going through that, and whether they're going to go beyond that and become financialized themselves, that's a possibility. And I don't know how the world is going to look in 20 years with Russia and China, and to what extent they'll be more financially capitalized like we are. But I hope and I think they've learned a lesson from it. But we have to learn the lesson in the United States. First of all, we got to change our economy, because our economy is destroying the society, and it's destroying the society. So someone like Elon Musk can become a goddamn trillionaire, and that's not. If our prime objective in society is to allow someone to become a trillionaire, then this is the way we live. And we're not going to have any places that we can afford to live anymore. And we're not going to have, affordable apartments and affordable homes and affordable restaurants. Because I just saw a thing about Panera and how private equity took that over. And, so this is, and that's what we want. But we have to change our society so that our primary purpose is the purpose purpose of housing is it's people to live in. The purpose of restaurants and food production is for people to eat and to have comfortable for ordinary people to have comfortable lives. Purpose of education is to get an education, not to get banks to make billions and trillions on student loans. This is absurd. So, and healthcare, the purpose of healthcare is to people to be healthy, not for people to be for insurance companies and hospitals and healthcare conglomerates to make billions of dollars. And this is, we have to, that's the road we're on. And we've advanced on that road quite dramatically in the last 30 years, and we have to take it back in some way or another. But that's a fight. That's our fight.
I'll say this as we segue into our next subject. I got this message from United Healthcare, and for people who don't know, that's the big one. Blue Cross Blue Shield, they're small potatoes. United Healthcare is the big boy. This thing is huge. How big is it? It lost $288 billion in valuation in like a week, right? Yeah. Which valuation, again, that's the whole fraudulent, system of saying this is how much it's worth, which means nothing. But it's a huge. Let's just say it's a major company. Now, knowing someone in that industry, one of the things I'm hearing is, there are a lot of these healthcare companies are in trouble because, let's just say, a lot of diseases that we didn't see, heart problems, myocarditis, heart attacks, turbo cancers, all of these things that were fairly rare aren't quite as rare as they used to be for some reason, which we don't know why. We have so YouTube should know, we have no clue why that's happening. There's no indicator, nothing's different. There's nothing that's changed. It's just all of a sudden, all of these things. But bottom line is, there are those in the industry who are arguing now, starting to say, if young people getting sick in cancers and things like that continues, that the model that they have will not work, because they have to, how it works. You got United Healthcare. The 20 and 30-year-olds pay in, the 50 and 60-year-olds need a hip transplant, and it all works out and you make a profit, which is not what we need to do, but at least it's work. But the 20 and 30-year-olds have pancreatic cancer, turbo cancer. The model don't work no more. Anyway, so I think they go say all that to say this. RFK Jr. It's interesting what we're watching now. Now, of course, we know since we are on YouTube, and we know that the jab is perfectly safe and effective. We recommend that everybody in the chat, if you haven't had it, get yours today, because they're safe and effective. And if you haven't had one, you should probably get a weekly one. Jim and I, in fact, before we go on the air, we both get a booster, and then after we go off the air, we both get a booster. And we also believe that Building 7 fell because it just felt bad. When the other buildings fell, it was just like, oh man, those are my friends. I think I'll collapse too. Down it went. But whatever the case may be, now that we've discovered that, now that we've said to let everybody know how important it is to get the safe and effective jab, let's try to figure out, why is it the big pharmacy and the whole system and all of these congressmen seem to be upset? Yes, don't start. Yes, I'm RFK Jr. and Zionism. Fair enough. Epstein got you there. Okay. But Jim and I also want to talk about this big pharma stuff, and it's important, Jim.
Yeah, well, let's put RFK Jr. to the side. Okay, for a second, because that's important. Okay. What we're facing, and because of the problems that have become evident and with the COVID vaccine, which by all accounts does not stop infection or transmission, and they knew that from the beginning, and they lied about it. Rachel Walensky got up and said, "You won't get COVID," and she knew that was false. But because of the problems with the COVID vaccine, a lot of the doctors who are criticized in this context, Peter McCullough, Robert Malone, Jay Bhattacharya, these are doctors who were solidly entrenched in what I call the vaccine credulity, ideology of vaccine credulity, which is essentially that vaccines are harmless magic bullets. They saved the world in the 20th century. I just saw today on MSNBC. Oh, the 60% of the children who died in 1900 were died from infectious diseases. We don't have that anymore. There's an ideology that was been built up over the past 30 years, 40 years, that has constructed the notion that vaccines are harmless magic bullets that save the world from infectious diseases. And really, you can't consider that they may be harmful in themselves. If you raise any objection to those things, there's something wrong with you. And a lot of the people, most of the people on the left and the right until recently, Just accepted that. I accepted it for most of my life. Absolutely. That's obvious. It's an ideology. And what I'm saying is when people attack someone as anti-vax or what they're saying is you've stepped out of that ideology. You're telling me I don't have to accept that I shouldn't think that vaccines are harmless magic bullets. Okay. And I just had this again, it's what I saw today on TV. It was repeated. Oh, the vaccines did away with infectious diseases. Now it's an historical fact. I just had this discussion with my high school classmates from the high school that Anthony Fauci went to that, vaccines stopped, all these infectious diseases, measles and whooping cough and diphtheria, they all disappeared because of vaccines. No, they did not. Vaccines were not responsible primarily for the disappearance of those infectious diseases in the 20th century. And that's known. It was acknowledged years ago. It was acknowledged in multiple places. And if you look at the charts, you'll see those diseases had practically disappeared, over 90%, most of them, by the time vaccines were invented. And they disappeared. What caused the decline of infectious disease mortality among young kids, which was real, was clean water, sanitation, sewers, uncrowded housing, was the change in social conditions of health, of good health. And that's known and accepted. Vaccines came in after those diseases were mostly gone. And you can tell that because anybody who's gotten scarlet fever or died of scarlet fever, any children dying of scarlet fever killed more kids than measles or diphtheria combined, I think. No longer exists. And it no longer exists, not because of a vaccine, which doesn't exist for scarlet fever, but because those conditions. So you have that's a fact. So that's one of the bricks that people carry in their heads about vaccine idea. Oh, vaccines did away with infectious diseases. No, they didn't. So that's just a fact. Okay. There are a whole bunch of little facts that people think, that go into this ideology that vaccines are just totally wonderful. So therefore they're not magic bullets. The other half of the fact is they're not harmless. Vaccines, like any other drug, have bad side effects, and they haven't been tested for that. None of the vaccines on the childhood schedule were tested with inert placebo, maybe one. None of them were tested, I think, for carcinogenicity or oncogenicity or which means we don't know whether the vaccines we're putting in our children cause cancer or not. So this scores of vaccines you're putting in children, and you don't know that. Buy there, look at the inserts. Buy the pharmaceuticals themselves don't know whether these vaccines cause cancer, and you're not supposed to think about that. So that's generally speaking. It occurred to me late in my life after accepting this. Wait a minute, these are not they're not magic bullets, and they're not harmless. And we have to talk about that like we would with any other drug. And vaccines don't get exempted from the same scientific critical scrutiny that any other drug would. And they shouldn't have light. And this only exploded. And this ideology was developed after the vaccine in 1986, when the Vaccine Safety Act when they were exempted from liability. So you've got this huge complex now of pharmaceutical companies that this is their biggest profit-making thing. They're selling vaccines that they have no liability for. They don't care what happens. They don't have to worry about it. And these are all paid for by the government. Yeah. Why are the vaccines free? Why is it the only drug in the world you get for free? They're not for free. The government's paying for it, but nobody complains about that because pharma has got its teeth in the government and is saying, okay, you pay for the vaccines and make people take them, and we'll take the profits, and we don't have any liability. And that's great. The greatest business model in the world. But there's a whole set of things. So I got to say this. If people who are watching this don't understand the level at which, as I was for most of my life, embedded in this harmless magic bullet ideology where everything about vaccines was great. Everybody thinks, for example, it's the first the one, that huge brick, which was vaccines did away with mortality from infectious diseases. No, they didn't, and it's demonstrable. Ask ChatGPT. When I did this on my email chat, one of the guys a doctor went to ChatGPT. Oh yeah, you're right. But there's another little thing from this. Is one of the things that everybody thinks they knows, and the problem is the guy said, "Oh, I wasn't aware of that." Well, it wasn't just that you weren't aware that vaccines didn't weren't the primary driver of ending mortality from these. It's that you were aware of something else. You've been carrying around in your head another story about how vaccines did away with mortality from infectious diseases that you were sure of and was not true. And you're astounded to hear the fact that they weren't. This is not just another little thing. It's a little thing, but it's important to understand why this is in this story, this narrative of vaccine. Everybody thinks Jonas Salk gave away his patent so that the world would have the vaccine for free. That is not true. And it's not a criticism of Jonas Salk. It's just the fact that Jonas Salk was working for a foundation and he had no right to the patent. His conditions of his work was he didn't have patent rights. He was an employee he was getting a grant from a foundation which they had the patent rights. So Jonas Salk didn't give away his patent to be a nice guy. He didn't have it to give away. That's not particularly a criticism of Jonas Salk. What it is everybody who's listening to this, and I guarantee you there are people listening to this, oh, that can't be true. I've heard that. I'm going to go check it. Everybody who's listening to this who thought for sure that they knew that Jonas Salk gave away his patent had been inculcated with a false fact that helped them. One of the bricks in this vaccines are harmless magic bullets, wonderful things that you can't criticize. Jonas Salk's story of giving away is one of the wonderful things about the history of vaccines. It's not true. And and what people would be astounded to learn, because they just attacked RFK for this, but what people will be astounded to learn is that if I sit here and say every case of polio in the United States in the last 15 years was because of the vaccine, I would be thrown off of YouTube. I would be told an anti-vaxxer, a moron. Well, I didn't say that. Jonas Salk said that in 1976, that every case of polio in the United States, the probable or likely sole cause of polio in every case in the last 15 years was the vaccine. He was meant the Sabin vaccine, which he didn't like, because scientists had at that point, until recently, until the 80s or 90s, they had real debates about this. And nobody suggested or could suggest these things were absolutely harmless. They just weren't. They have problems. So the first thing to get beyond is this ideology. And you don't get beyond it until you realize that you're in it. For me, and personally, like racism, you may not think you're racist, but you're in a racist society. You may not think you're in it, but you're in an ideology about vaccines that is anti-scientific. Vaccines are not some magical things that are exempt from all the critical scrutiny you'd give every other thing. So that's number one. And RFK Jr. at some point in his life, late in his life, like me, glommed onto this, discovered this fact, and it became a cause of his. Now, RFK Jr. now is, and he would have gone with the Democrats. The Democrats probably would have won the election if RFK Jr., like these other doctors, was a liberal Democrat. He was a standard liberal Democrat. These doctors were all read their testimonies. I was a standard liberal Democrat until this COVID came along. And then all this nonsense, which is obviously anti-scientific and untrue and false. And they're trying to force people to do things that are ridiculous. And that turned me. So this has been politically a disaster for some reason. And it was the liberals who did this. They politicized this. You can watch Andrew Cuomo and Kamala Harris. Well, during Trump's administration, while his warp speed vaccine was being invented, I won't take that vaccine. I won't take Trump's CDC. I won't take Trump's vaccine. Then the minute the administration changed and Biden was president, it was the same vaccine from the same pharmaceutical companies and the same CDC run by Fauci. And not only will I take it, but I'm going to force you to take it too. And this was just such baloney. And everybody has been angry about that. The 7 million people, at least, who were fired from their jobs for not taking a vaccine that doesn't stop transmission or infection or transmission. The 7 million people, the 8 million who were forced to change jobs, they're not happy with that. So you're going to go to them and tell them you were just stupid and racist. That's why you got fired from your job. No, because I didn't want to put something in my body, which is potentially harmful, and it is. So these are all the things. Now, RFK Jr. made the devil's deal with Trump because he wanted to do something about this issue. And unfortunately, Trump was the one who gave him so far the leeway to do it. Okay. And he's now, of course, there's other things about RFK because he was just a liberal Democrat, Zionist imperialist. He was. That's not, so there was nothing other great about RFK Jr. I'm not and I'll state for the record that RFK read my article in 2021 about anti-mandate article, and he communicated with me and he appreciated it. He gave me positive reviews. So, I've had a nice exchange with him about that, but I also wrote an article criticizing him about a lot of other things and saying that I think that that his alliance with Trump may end up discrediting, I hope it doesn't, his Maha agenda, let's put it that way, because he's got to get up there and kiss Trump's ass and tell him, oh, Trump's done such a wonderful job redecorating the Oval Office and he should get the Nobel Peace Prize. This is all nonsense, and he knows it's nonsense. And so that's all, besides he's going to be compromised by his association with Trump. And what's happening now is that the pharma is now on a full court press against him because what he's done, he's not preventing anybody from getting the vaccines. He's just removing them from the schedule. He's removing them from the approved list. And in doing that, they no longer have liability protection. In doing that, the fewer people are going to take them. So the pharma knows that he is changing things, and he's going to start. If he starts doing placebo trials for vaccines, they're going to get screwed. If he has real data on the vaccines, they hid the data. They destroyed data. They hid the data. If he has real data about it, they're going to get screwed. And so they want to get rid of him now, and they're going to work on the Republicans and on Trump. And I think it's a 50-50 chance at best that RFK will survive the next year before Trump gives up on him. Look, while he was Steve Bannon was attacking Trump, while RFK was giving this yesterday, getting attacked by the Senate and giving it back to them. Well, Trump is there with Bill Gates and Zuckerberg. Bill Gates,
he probably killed half of Africa testing vaccines on him.
The vaccine king. So, Trump is not, again, I'm sure that Kennedy, because Trump knew that Kennedy was a big factor in getting him to, and he was, I'm sure.
Yes, he was.
Kennedy's presence.
Him and Tulsi Gabbard. Him and Tulsi Gabbard were two people that brought him some people that may not normally vote for him.
And the Democrats could have had him.
Yes, both of them. They did have him. They did have him. They did have him. But the party of what's her name, Liz Cheney.
Yeah.
What's interesting is what you were just saying. And this is what I find interesting, and I didn't really know this until COVID. And that is, look, I'm like this. People should be able to discuss anything.
Yes.
If I believe something, you should walk up and say, Garland, I don't think that's right. And I should say, all right, hold on. Let me get a beer and let me sit here. Tell me why it's not right. I should be willing to say, all right, I believe this with all my heart and soul. Some guy has something that says it's wrong. Let's hear it, right?
Yep.
And if it's vaccines, if somebody's like, vaccines are the greatest thing ever, I should say, okay, well, that sounds great. It's good enough. I don't know, whatever. But Jim Kavanaugh here and these other doctors so-and-so had some evidence to say that we need to look more into them and we had blah, blah, blah. I should be willing to listen to that.
Yeah.
RFK Jr. saying things like, well, I think some of this stuff might cause autism. We need to look into it. No, whatever you do, don't look into it. We know it doesn't cause autism. Well, then why wouldn't you want us to look into it? Because you just shouldn't, because we already know.
No.
What do we need? I'm like, I wasn't there like Voltaire and the Enlightenment period when like we supposedly stopped believing things as a matter of what's the term faith, as they put it, believing things as a matter of faith. That's what it is. So if somebody says, I got an issue. I remember when the whole jab thing started, and all these people I knew. Oh yeah, I got Johnson & Johnson. I got this. What did you get, Garland? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to be the first in line. That was one thing I said. I said, I ain't going to be the first in line. I'm going to wait. And I was thinking to myself, and see how you guinea pigs, if you live, I'm going to give a few months before I make any decisions, right? I'm going to wait. And then it all happened. And the more I watched and I saw some things happening that raised my eyebrows a little bit. And then I saw breakthrough infections. And I'm like, why do you need the word breakthrough? Either you're infected or you ain't.
Yeah.
And then all of these things happened. And several months later, and then I looked into these details and somebody's like, well, Garland, why did you? And I'm like, well, based on the percentage of people that go to the hospital and die alone, the numbers are on my side. I'm fine. So I don't, but when it first started, the numbers are on my side. I'm okay. And I'm only going to take that risk. And I was like doing exercise and I was watching all this stuff. I'm taking vitamin D3. I'm eating mushrooms. I'm eating herb. I'm doing all of these things to try to say, okay, I'll do some stuff to help boost my immune system. My last option was going to be some medicine from some company, especially Pfizer, that I don't trust.
Yeah.
And then after a while, it got to a point where I'm like, yeah, okay, I think I'm not going to do it. But I left an open mind. I didn't start off saying, no, I'm absolutely not going to do it. I actually started off saying, let's see how this thing works out. To me, that's a good way to do. And then next thing I know, people are telling me, you're a madman. You're an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah.
Then they're telling people who got the vaccine and got vaccine injured. You're a madman. You're a vaccine. Then they're like, then it went to the truckers. They're a bunch of white supremacists and Nazis. And I'm like, I think this thing's going a little too far. And then I knew when I saw the attacks coming from the top on people who were just questioning things, I knew, something's rotten in Denmark. And that's how I really knew I was on the wrong side. I mean, on the right side, excuse me, if you know what I'm saying.
This is the point. Vaccines have been turned into sacred objects that people protect. They feel some need to protect the sacrality, the magical, wonderful quality of vaccines. And they're complicated biochemical products that have different kinds of effects on your immune system. They work by tricking your immune system. That's the way they work. And that's not going to have no effect whatsoever. And they work by having all kinds of adjuvants or either live viruses or a lot of adjuvants. And, again, one of my favorite people, look her up, Christine Stable-Ben, Danish vaccinologist. And she's very clear about this. And she was, this came to me years before Donald Trump was a glimmer in the political eye of the United States. He wasn't a political person. This has nothing to do with, how can anybody a priori state, if you have a problem with vaccines, you're right wing. That's just stupid. That's just ridiculous.
A white supremacist, I might add, which I got called literally by people like my picture wasn't up. They're like, yeah, you're one of those Trump or white supremacists. I'm like, boy, is my family going to be surprised when they find that out.
Yeah, this is a serious scientific question that you got to look at the details of, and it takes a little while. And you have to drop and understand you're in this bubble, this very walled garden of vaccine ideology, harmless magic bullets. You got to say, oh my God, no, drop all those bricks and go to the facts and look at what's going on, like you would with any other drug. Thalidomide was a great drug for nausea. It wasn't for something else. Vaccine may stop you from getting measles. What else is it doing to you? Yeah. And it's not like that question. You can't ask that question, or you'd be called a moron or anti-vaxxer. You ask that. That's a sign. I saw another discussion today on MSC also about the vaccine, and everybody's assumption was that the vaccines themselves are harmless.
Yeah,
that's an assumption, and it's a false assumption for any medical product, any drug. But somehow you think it's okay. Not only is it okay to have that assumption, but you have to attack everybody or anybody who questions that assumption. They are not harmless. They carry risks, and you've got to know what those risks are. And the fundamental principle, as Christine Stable-Ben, this is the fundamental principle of scientific and medical ethics: informed consent. That's why the guy, I'm against mandatory vaccination. I'm for what the Surgeon General of Florida is doing. Mandatory vaccination is canceling informed consent. It's saying we for vaccines, as opposed to any other medical product, you don't have informed consent. We can force you to take them. We can coerce you to take them. And this is this is absolutely, this was enshrined in international law at the end of World War II for good reason, because people were given drugs like syphilis, and they were given drugs without, and medical interventions without informed consent. That is fundamental scientific medical ethics. And there's nobody can tell me there isn't a good reason for doing that, for exempting vaccines from that medical ethic. This is informed consent. And you have to acknowledge, if you're in favor of mandatory vaccination, you are saying, for these products, anything the CDC says should be on the childhood schedule, we do away with informed consent, and we force people to take them. We coerce them. You can't go to school. You can't go to work. So this, if you have to acknowledge, if you're in favor of mandatory vaccination, that you are in favor of denying the principle of informed consent. Just do away with it for vaccines. And that is something you should really not be so comfortable with. We know the history of this, and there's no reason to be comfortable with this about vaccines. If you want to come to a conclusion about that, you better know what you're talking about. You're telling me that children should be coerced to take medical interventions that have never been shown that they don't cause cancer. Well, you do away with informed consent about that. Who has the right to make the decision whether I want to take that risk or not, or whether my child has to take that risk or not? So these are these are the principles. The principles are, as you say, we should be able to talk about anything. You don't.
Yes.
It's silly. Scientific, critical discussion about any medical product should be the same. Vaccines are no different. The principle of informed consent is a principle that you're either agree, is a fundamental principle, or it's just something that you can do away with every once in a while for things that you don't like. And that the most profitable pharmaceutical things in the world. So these are principles you have to stay with. So the personalities involved in it, RFK Jr. or whatever, they're people who come to this and who came to it and who are working on it in various ways. But we got to have a discussion about this, because the assertion is, the possibility is that the increase in, again, they're not harmless, they're not magic bullets, and they're not harmless. And they may be responsible for the increase in chronic diseases among children and among kids that didn't exist and didn't exist in my generation.
Let me add this, but as an example, but we need the data to know. For instance, the jab just happened. Well, you know what? All these tens and hundreds of millions of people that got this jab, they should be researching data for everything. Every single thing. Did they cause you to get, I don't know, hair loss? Did they charge you to get, nail fungus? Anything, everything that could possibly be, they should say, in the best interest of humanity, because so many people got this, we need to get all the data that we can. So in the future, if something happens, and should we use mRNA, and should we tweak this one? You know what I mean? The data, that's science. Instead, they want to attack the guy like me that says we need the data. I'm seeing some things that are pretty horrifying here. I've seen some things that are really kind of scary to me. And I want to know if it's related, because they could dramatically affect our society. I got friends, I got family members, and now I got to turn on the news. You check the news and it's like, here's one: measles infected passenger traveled from New York to Israel. I'm sure it's the same. When I grew up, nobody.
I had measles.
Everybody had measles.
Everybody.
You come home, Mom, I got these little red bugs. The measles, you'll be home for a few days, whatever. Right? Chicken pox. Nobody. And now it's like, oh my God, there's a child in this county that has the measles. People are walking around with these CDC spacesuits on and oxygen. I'm like, everybody
had measles parties and chicken pox parties. If one kid in school got chicken pox, they'd have a party, so the other kids would come to the party and all get chicken pox, because they wanted them to get chicken, because you get better immunity from that. That was still going on.
Now I can't say, it's just that if people are like, yes, RFK, they're spreading measles. And if I say, well, for starters, I don't think he's spreading measles, but for secondly, when I grew up, the measles, that wasn't like polio, things like that, pretty bad. Measles, measles ain't the real bad deal. Theoretically, you can die from it, but you know what? every year you have somebody that takes a Tylenol and has a reaction that dies. A certain amount of people. You have
a lot of
people
people
that
take
die
Tylenol.
from getting their heads.
Tylenol has a lot of problems.
Look,
But
Tylenol and what's the other one? The NSAIDs. You know, the ibuprofen.
Yeah.
They when they came out, it was like, these things are great, they're wonderful, like, yo, pain. And then they're like, oh crap, these things can do really, especially if you take too many of them, they can really do a number on you. When they first came out, it was great. And then after a while, they're like, yeah, you probably should drink a lot of water with that. Don't take too much, and your kidneys are going to fall out.
Any drug, you got to be careful about any drug. You're doing things to your system that you can't take for granted. But the point about data is extremely important. And they were attacking. One of the things they were attacking. You tell me you don't know how many people died of COVID? Oh, you've been at NIH for 8 months. You don't know how many. The fact is, nobody knows how many people died of COVID because they counted people who died from gunshot wounds. Anybody who came to a hospital and got a positive PCR test and died was counted as a COVID death, even if
they admitted that
of a gunshot wound. They admit it's. I can show you the videos of the health commissioners saying that's right. Even if it's a clear alternate cause, we count it as a COVID death, and that was for economic. The COVID, the hospitals knew they get paid for that. Okay, because once again, it was Medicare for all with COVID. Interesting, but anyway, the point is. It's true that nobody knows. And they deliberately said, and Fauci himself said it at one point when he was on MSNBC or CNN, when they were worried about, all of a sudden there was this surge in children's deaths. And he didn't want to acknowledge that there could be a surge in deaths from COVID because everybody's taking on the vaccine. So he said, oh, well, yeah, but all those children who died from went into the hospital with COVID, maybe didn't die from COVID because they had a PCR tested. So he acknowledged this, but that was the entire apparatus. That was the framework that the CDC set. We are going to create a situation which is going to make it impossible for us to know who died from COVID or who happened to die with a positive PCR test from COVID. And it is impossible to know. That's not, RFK didn't invent that problem. That problem was invented by the CDC that he wants to change. And that has to be changed. We have to have real, transparent data that measures, because they don't want to see. That's why they count people. That's why, we know that the people who were vaccinated were in the hospital, people who were unvaccinated weren't, because they didn't count you as vaccinated until 2 weeks after you got the vaccine. So if you got vaccinated and died that night, you were an unvaccinated person who died. And that's just phony. This is phony data. And they do that deliberately because they are ensconced and want to protect and promote the vaccine ideology, which is we have to think, and you have to think of vaccines as harmless magic bullets, and anything we say is a vaccine. Not only you should be, ultimately everybody kind of assumes that if something's a vaccine, it's okay to mandate it. This is nuts. This is just prima facie nuts. Even if a drug is good for preventing you from having an upset stomach, that doesn't mean you mandate it. You know what I mean?
You know what we should have, Jim? I ain't got no problem with this. A group of scientists presenting their evidence saying this is why we should mandate it. A group of scientists presenting their evidence saying this is why we shouldn't, and legal authorities saying, well, based on informed consent, we can't mandate it because, this and that. And a robust, intellectual, scientific, philosophical argument that people can go online and watch that says the decisions we made were based on this. One of the issues I had during COVID was this. You weren't allowed to ask why. 6 feet. And everybody was like, well, why 6 feet? Why is it that if I'm in a restaurant standing up, COVID doesn't get me? I sit down and take my mask off, COVID just flies over my head. And we were like, why 6 feet? And they were like, shut up, you anti-vaxxer. We're like, why 6 feet? What is it about 6 feet? What? Shut up, get away from us. You're killing people. And then afterwards, they come out
plague carrier.
And they were like, that just seemed like a good number. They admitted there was
They said that, yeah.
Yeah,
Walensky admitted that. I think it was Walensky. They said, "How did you formulate these policies?" She said, "Well, I just talked to my friends about it, and then we figured out maybe that sounds good." I mean, this is what they did. Fauci got on television with a doctor and asked him, "Should people wear masks?" And he goes, "No, don't worry. People don't. It can be worse for you to wear masks. They really don't help. They don't stop viruses." And the guy said on television, 60 Minutes, Are you sure? People are listening to you in the country, and you're telling them masks don't work. And he goes, yeah, they don't really work. They don't. That's not. And he was saying that in private in emails. And then 2 months later, because the line changed, oh, everybody's got to wear masks. Oh, you should wear 2, maybe 3 masks. He did a whole triple masking scenario.
Yes.
And it was just ridiculous. It was prima facie ridiculous. You know, I didn't know that. In fact, I thought masks were good. But then when I looked into it, I saw that all the studies about masks were viruses are too small. It's like throwing sand at a chain link fence.
Right.
Masks do not work against viruses. And he said that, and he knew it. And then 2 months later, oh, the science has changed. No, it didn't. The science didn't change in 2 months. The line changed. The line that came down, which was now we got to push people, because you have to fearmonger to push people, make everybody feel like they absolutely must take the goddamn vaccine. They absolutely must, and it's fine to mandate it, because otherwise everybody's going to die if they don't mask up. Stand 6 feet away and take the vaccine.
He said, remember this? How many times did he change herd immunity?
Yeah.
We're going to reach herd immunity. This will get herd immunity. Excuse me. Everything was about herd immunity. And we're going to get 2 weeks ahead of the curve. You know, they had these things. We got to stay ahead of the herd. In 2 weeks, will it beat the curve? We're going to stay behind the curve. We're ahead of the curve. Herd immunity. Oh, no, we got 60%. No, if 80% of the people are vaccinated, we'll get herd immunity. Why'd you say 60%? Well, I thought it'd be a good number. Yeah. But then I decided to go with 80%. And you're like, you're sitting here changing thing every couple of weeks at random. And then you're telling me you just made it up. At some point, I just got to say you're a bullshitter. And I've got to figure this thing out on my own. At what point do I say, I got to figure this out on my own, because whatever's convenient at the time is what you're going to say. No, I got to that point fairly quickly.
Back to that point, the fundamental point, informed consent. People should be given the arguments and the evidence and make their own decisions about this. This is things that are being put in your body that are changing your immune system and doing things to your body, and you should know what they're doing. You should be given every side of the evidence and the arguments and make your own decision for yourself and your children. That is informed consent. I see no reason to do away with informed consent. It is extremely dangerous to do that, to have the state tell you, you have to take this medical intervention whether you want to or not. And, you can invent emergency scenarios where it might, in a very extreme case, might be necessary to do something like that. But this isn't the case. You don't do it as a default mechanism for everything that's called a vaccine, and you don't do it. You do this very carefully, and you do it in a way that everybody can understand, and you present all the evidence and arguments. And overwhelmingly, for every, the default situation should never be anything but informed consent. Show me the evidence, show me the arguments, tell me what the danger is of me not taking this vaccine or of taking the vaccine. And don't tell me there's no danger to taking the vaccine. Tell me what the dangers are, what the possible risks are, because there's no drug from Tylenol that doesn't have possible risks. It may be a stomach ache and it may be brain cancer. Tell me. And then I'll decide whether I want to take that risk in order to prevent myself from the risk of getting the measles.
Let me show you something. Just as a matter of fact, we're just about out of time, but let me show you something. And I like to always go on Google, because Google will tell you what the system wants you to think, right? You do a Google search and you'll find out, okay, so I just searched RFK Jr. That's just a Google search, right? Yeah. Nothing more, a Google search for RFK Jr. Let's look at what the system gives me. Wait a minute, sorry about that. All right. What does the system say? Trump's former Surgeon General calls for RFK Jr. to be fired. Trump breaks from RFK on vaccines. Health Secretary, the link used in pregnancy sending company stock price spiraling. Oh, gee. Yeah. I wonder why
pregnant women shouldn't take a drug. There's a drug that pregnant women should be, and the real problem there is that the stock price is going down.
Exactly. Fellow Kennedys call on RFK Jr. to resign. Yep. Well, we don't have to look at the takeaways from New York Times. We know that. Yep. Wall Street Journal. We got something about Tylenol use to autism. Okay. Now here's when I feel like he's probably right. RFK Jr. draws ire from both sides.
Yeah.
And
Look,
even
a lot
worse,
of people,
Putin.
a lot of people in the so-called Maha movement are pissed off that he's not stopped taking the mRNA drugs, vaccines off the market. They consider them, and I think with good reason, extremely dangerous. The mechanism of action of the mRNA vaccines is brand new. It was never tried in human beings before. It always failed in animal tests. And I encourage people to watch Dr. John Campbell, the British guy. I mean, again, a wonderful guy. And he started out, he's very careful. He's very considerate. And he started out, oh yeah, well, let's look at this and look, this looks like a problem, but you should get that. You should get the vaccine.
Yes,
They're really good.
He said that.
And he took them a while and same thing with Malone and McCullough. They started out, and then after it all, they said, no, now that we've discovered this problem with COVID, I got to look at the issue of vaccines in general. And they all did. And they said, this is not what I thought it was. So this is an issue. And again, as someone who grew up with this, I was one of the first polio, vaccine kids. So as someone who grew up with this and who thought, vaccine's the greatest thing since sliced bread, wonderful, and it took me, holy crap, this is not what I thought it was. Something else has been going on here. And I've been given this, it's like thinking of American history in terms of the struggle for democracy, and then you decide, oh, something else is going on here. This is, the whole history of vaccines, the history and the science of vaccines are not what the vaccine ideology you have been embedded in, unless you've looked at it very carefully, as I was. You have been embedded in this. It's not what that tells you it is. And I give again the example of vaccines were not responsible for the decline in mortality from these infectious diseases in the 20th century. They were not the primary.
You know what? I'll give you an example. I remember when this kid named Seth Rich got killed. And I remember like people online starting to say there's something suspicious in here, right? And I mean, this was the big cover up. You could not say Seth Rich. You couldn't touch that issue on anything. If you said something about Seth Rich on Twitter, you were shut down. Facebook, you shared it, you were shut down. If you did a YouTube show and you even breathed the word Seth Rich, you're demonetized, whatever, right? And at that point, I was like, there's something to this. Anytime I see something and the whole system says, don't you go there, I know, I'm like, I think they killed him, and I think the FBI's covered it up. I'm like, what else would they? Otherwise, they'd say to us, you guys should talk more about Seth Rich. They set us up. When they point us in a particular direction, you should talk about this. That ain't it. But as soon as they say don't touch, and as soon as you say, I don't know that much about vaccines, but I think we should have a robust discussion about them and figure this thing out. I don't know. I look at myself and I say, I got friends who have had blood clots and have said to me, I think I got it because of this. I never had and I never knew a lot of people with blood clots. And now all these people got a bunch of people that I know. Yeah. I know a few people, just a number of people that had cancer in the past. And they're like, yay, I beat cancer. And they're like, it's come back. And I know a lot of people. And I'm like,
I know too.
Anecdotally speaking in my life, I don't know for sure, but just anecdotally speaking, I'm like, I never knew this many young people who had blood clots and this and that. And I'm seeing things I've never seen before, right? Jeez, LeBron James' son was 19. He had a heart attack on his college basketball team. He was the second kid on that team to have a heart attack. I played basketball in high school. I played junior college. I watched one. You never saw. There was Hank Gathers was like a kid that played in, back in the 1980s or something that dropped it. It didn't happen. And then it dropped it like flies. And I'm like, you know what? I think two kids on the same team, perhaps we should try to figure out why that happened. And
the answer you can say, oh, we don't know for sure. Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
But you can't then tell me what you can't say is, I know for sure it wasn't that.
Do you remember there was a game and there was a Buffalo Bills? It was a Sunday night game. I was watching it. And this one guy, he's running down the field. He gets involved in a tackle. Fair enough. He gets up. Boom, he drops.
Yeah.
And he wasn't breathing and all this kind of stuff. Right. And so then everybody's like, everybody's like, oh, let me see. They're mandating everything, and this guy's a professional, and he just drops, right? And then you saw all of these articles, and they said, we're not sure what it is, but we know what it isn't.
We know what it is.
Like, those things
you
are
don't.
mutually
No, you don't.
exclusive. If you don't know what it is, by definition, you don't know what it isn't.
Don't know what it
But
is.
all we saw was this kid dropped and his heart stopped, and they were somehow able to save him. Now, we're not sure what it is. But those people that are saying they think it's this, we know for sure that it's wrong, and we know it. We're so sure about it that they have to be thrown off of social media. If they say, you can't say, I think that's what it is, but you can say, I know that's what it's not.
Yeah, it's totally nuts, and it's completely anti-scientific. It's epistemologically ridiculous. You can't do that. So, and that's a sign of religious, a pseudo-religious, a quasi-religious attachment to something. It's a sacred object. You can't question it. And as you say, what's interesting is when some kind of weird theory comes up, I don't want to use the word conspiracy, but some kind of weird theory of the case comes up, which is contradicts the official story and the official narrative. What ends up often being the thing that persuades me is the reaction of the people who are trying to defend it. That reaction is something which says, oh, this is not right. This reaction is the reaction of someone who's not wanting to think about this issue, but wants to defend a position and stop people from thinking about this issue. That's what words like anti-vaxxer and conspiracy theorists do. They are not words to explain something. They're epithets to insult and to prevent thinking or talking about an issue any further.
Yeah. It collapsed. Anti-vaccine, blah, 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 but all it was, and I never forgot that. It's like, how can any person who understands how logic works say, I don't know what it is, have no idea, but I do know what it isn't?
Yeah.
Well, here's what they were really saying. I'm allowed to say we don't know what it is. You're not allowed to say, is it even possible that it could be this? Nope, you're not even allowed to say that. You're not allowed to say, is it possible that could be it? Nope, not allowed to it. And that's where we are.
That's exactly my point. The thrust is to stop you from thinking about certain things, to stop you from talking about certain things. And that is an anti-intellectual, anti-scientific, quasi-religious attitude. It's protecting a sacred object that you can't talk about, you can't question.
It's the Dark Ages. It's, you know what it is? Let's go all the way full circle. It's the coalition of the willing, saying we're going to send troops to Russia, and Russia doesn't have a say in it when you've already lost the war to Russia. You're right. It's medieval Dark Ages saying we believe this, but it's not true in the real world, but we believe it as a matter of faith. So it has to be true. Well, all of that. Thanks a lot, Jim. That was a blast. Certainly appreciate it. Everybody, let's hear it for Jim Kavanaugh, Dr. Jim Kavanaugh.
Love the applause of the crowd. Please visit my Substack and subscribe and see what I have to say.
And of course, we got to get a word from Keir Starmer. And maybe a word from Brigitte Macron. All right, everybody.
All right,
thanks a lot, everybody. Same thing. Check out Dr. Jim's Substack. It's really good. He writes a lot of articles on all kinds of things that the mainstream may consider controversial, but those of us who use logic and reason and try to figure things out and are open-minded certainly need to be discussed. I guess we're crazy because we're suspicious about 9/11 and COVID.
No, we've never talked about that.
That's something we need to talk about next. We need to do a show on 9/11 because I was watching this thing the other day, right? And they had a video of Building 7, and it went straight down like this, right? And they said, look, and there was this guy saying, "Now watch this," and he was this was at some hearing. And this guy was like an engineer, like a well-known engineer, architect, all this stuff, right? And he's saying, okay, if you watch, it falls perfectly in his footprint. And he showed it. He goes, now watch this. This is a video of a building that's done with, when they make it collapse themselves. What do they call it? When they blow
demolition, controlled demolition.
And then he put them side by side.
Yeah.
And he's like, now we even measured it. it dropped like 20 feet in the first second, which is normal.
Yeah.
And they were like, now watch this. And they brought him, and they were just like, exact same timing, same everything. And he gave the number. This is how many pounds of steel. This is how many pounds of concrete. This is what it takes for that. Blah, 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 blah. And he talked about the building. These buildings are made in case there's an earthquake, they can give this much. So if the plane hit the building, but over it, the shock wave wouldn't have done it because they're made to waver in an earthquake. So if it went down from a shock wave, it would have went sideways one way or the other. There's just no way that, and they both like at the same speed.
There's a famous video of showing to some. He was a engineer in Denmark or something, and it was before people talked about starting to talk about Building 7, and they said they showed him. They said, what are you watching here? And it was they showed him a thing of Building 7 falling down. And he goes, well, that's a controlled demolition. And he goes, that happened on 9/11. He goes, what? He goes, that building came down like that on 9. Because it wasn't the towers. It was. He said that building came down on 9/11 like that. No, people weren't seeing that. And he said that was a controlled demolition. I can't believe I haven't seen this before. So it's Building 7 is the single bullet of the 9/11. It's like
a single bullet. And we might mention it's also safe and effective.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Share this on all your social media platforms and go make sure you subscribe to Jim Kavanaugh's, and you can join if you want to. It's fairly inexpensive to hit Substack and support Jim. Follow me on all your social media platforms and all that kind of stuff. We're out.